these are grim times for Russia's opposition, for decent people everywhere who are revolted by Putin and his regime. The blunt, terrible fact is that if you're in a Russian jail, I'm afraid you can be killed at any time.
Most everyone knows that you've got a deep history in studying Russia and the Kremlin and Russian intelligence, and you've had your own run-ins with Russian intelligence as well, some of which we've read in your books. But I'd like to first ask you, what are your thoughts about the death of Alexei Navalny?
Um, it's pretty clear that Putin murdered him, and we can say that not because we have the proof. Of course, we don't know precisely what took place last week in a remote Arctic prison camp where Navalny had been incarcerated ever since he flew back to Moscow from Germany, where of course he was recovering, having been poisoned by agents of the FSB, the Putin's sort of special services. But what we do know from previous assassinations, from the murders of critics, of other opposition people, from Soviet history, is that someone of Navalny's importance, that really the most famous, fated opposition leader inside Russia, known across the world, that matters of life or death involving Navalny could only be decided by one person, and that person is Vladimir Putin. And of course, the other thing that you have to acknowledge is timing. There's a presidential election happening in Russia next month. You have to say election in air quotes because obviously it's not a real competitive election. And one thing I know from my experience of Russia is that those guys are extremely risk averse. They are paranoid. They have long regarded Navalny as not just as an irritant, but a threat. And his death, I would say his murder on the eve of an election, of course, I think is really Kremlin housekeeping, unfortunately, of the most terrible and sinister kind.
Yeah. Your books, A Very Expensive Poison, Collusion. You talk about you write about the way in which Russian intelligence goes about these kinds of murders, or alleged murders in this case. Can you maybe speculate a bit about what could possibly have happened to Navalny?
Well, I mean, I think you have to sort of put yourself in Vladimir Putin's sort of strange, dark mental world, and look at how he sees things. Not just him, but the circle around him of basically former KGB operatives. Although, of course, there's no former in the KGB. They see themselves as waging an eternal war against the West in general and against America in particular. And they have their own kind of internal code. There are kind of enemies. There are foreign spies. There's Joe Biden. There's you and me. But they reserve their special hatred for Russians, whom they regard as traitors, and that's anyone who's worked at the American embassy, anyone who has criticized Russia's invasion of Ukraine, people who don't support the regime and its politics, and in particular for kind of opposition leaders. And so Navalny was regarded as not just as a traitor, but as a kind of arch traitor. So I've long feared that this would happen, that he would be killed. We have seen this happen with so many other people. I wrote a whole book, as you mentioned, A Very Expensive Poison, about Alexander Litvinenko, who was a former FSB officer turned dissident critic of Vladimir Putin, murdered in 2006 in a special operation with a radioactive cup of tea in central London, practically under the noses of the CIA. The American embassy was just across the square. And these murders are sometimes sort of silent. You don't see the Kremlin's hand, or it's sort of its glove in a fist. And sometimes they are loud, splashy, theatrical, in your face, demonstrative. So that there's a spectrum. But the fact is that Russia has a series of assassins, trained field operatives who work inside Russia, who murder people across Europe, and sometimes even do special operations in the United States.
That is the thing that I wanted to ask next. Mikhail Lesin, Dan Rappaport. We have no proof, according to law enforcement, that either of them were killed. It seems to be suicides. But there is a boatload of people, some law enforcement, some intelligence, some journalists like us, who suspect that there may have been some kind of Russian intelligence hand in this. Do you get the sense that they have a significant capability inside the United States and other places like London, your home?
I mean that's a very good question. I mean, my sense, for what it's worth, is that they, of course, they can do special operations in the US. They can bribe politicians. They can helped Donald Trump win the election in 2016. I mean, we know all about this. We've had Mueller, we've had 4 years of allegations, counter allegations, and we ended up with a really interesting intelligence document, bipartisan document by the Senate Intelligence Committee, looking at compromise, looking at Russian agents of influence. So clearly, it's a field where Russian espionage takes place. In terms of murdering people, I think it can happen. I think Mikhail Lesin is a question mark. He may well have been killed in the center of DC by Russian assassins, but obviously it's very hard to prove that. Certainly in my town in London, there have been numerous cases. I mean, Litvinenko, I mentioned, also Sergei Skripal, targeted by two assassins from the GRU, that's Russian military intelligence, with Novichok, this lethal nerve agent. That was an enormous scandal of a few years ago. But even lesser known cases. I mean, you mentioned suicide. You remember Boris Berezovsky, the Russian oligarch, who was found dead in 2012 in his ex-wife's house. Coroner, that's investigator, recorded an open verdict. But a lesser known case, which I was personally involved in, one of Berezovsky's close friends was called Nikolai Glushkov, who 5 years later was murdered at his home where he lived alone in the west of London by an unknown assailant who tried to make it look like suicide, sort of strung him up with a dog lead. And of course, he'd been murdered. So these things happen, and the bloody trail goes all the way back to Moscow.
Yeah. And folks, Luke is not speaking about this based on just research for a book or for reporting. He's had personal experience, right, Luke? I can recall reading one of your books where you were in Russia and you spent some time, I believe it was in the Fortovo. Um, but before that, there were these moments where you would come home and find certain things on the floor in your house.
Yeah,
Or
yeah. I mean, you're right. I mean, I had 4 years in Moscow as the Guardian's bureau chief between 2007 and 2011, and it was a bit like being in a really badly written, badly directed, badly acted spy thriller. I
yeah,
mean, not Netflix, much worse than Netflix or HBO. I mean, it was really terrible, and it involved curious young men wearing cheap black leather jackets, following me around the streets of Moscow, sitting next to me in restaurants. We had a series of break-ins at our family apartment where I live with my wife and my two small kids. And
yeah,
we were basically advised by the British Embassy, because I didn't know what was going on, that these were break-ins by the FSB, the Federal Security Service, that this happened all the time, particularly against Americans and Brits, who were very, very hated, even a decade ago, back in Putin's Moscow. And on one occasion, as you say, I was called by the FSB, told I was being interrogated in connection with an article I had written about the Russian oligarch Boris Berezovsky, who was a big Putin critic at that time. And I went to Lefortovo, and it was one of the most strange moments of my life, going to this KGB detention center, which is famous for its prison for high profile VIP prisoners, where Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter, has been held for a year downstairs. I was upstairs in the detention suite,
yeah,
walking down this kind of gloomy corridor with like 1960s style cameras following my every movement, and interrogated by this kind of bland young FSB colonel. And clearly, the episode was supposed to kind of intimidate me and spook me. And my Moscow career ended about 3 years later, after on-off harassment for a very long time, phone calls intercepted, strange stuff going on,
Yeah.
when I was deported out of Moscow in 2011. Now since then, things have got worse, and
Really?
meaningful journalism in Russia has practically ceased. But what's interesting is that what Putin is doing, both in his international operations and domestically, is the Soviet playbook. So these break-ins, the bugging of my apartment, it's all very, very Soviet. So the ideology has changed. Communism has gone. Some people thought the Cold War was over, but those techniques of harassment, of subversion, of intimidation, of sometimes murder continue.
Yeah. Two more quick questions and I'll let you go. Luke, thank you so much for sharing that story. Um, Now, where do we go from where we are now? Because there is deep concern for Vladimir Kara-Murza and other Russian opposition figures that are in prison now in Russia. Especially after in the piece that you wrote the other day regarding the helicopter pilot in Spain, um, Maxim Kuzminov, who turned up dead in Spain. There's deep concern for Kara-Murza and others. What's next? What's your view on what we should expect and maybe what the world's leaders should do?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I know Vladimir Kara-Murza. I've met his wonderful wife Evgenia,
Yes.
who lives in Virginia and has been incredibly active campaigning for her husband's release. Um, these are grim times for Russia's opposition, for decent people everywhere who are revolted by Putin and his regime. Um, the blunt, terrible fact is that if you're in a Russian jail, I'm afraid you can be killed at any time. The authorities can kill you at any time, and it's again with high profile people, it's Putin who would decide that, but their lives are hanging by a thread. I wrote this about Alexei Navalny a year ago, that his life was hanging by a thread, and one morning, for whatever reason, Putin decided to snap that thread. Um, so it can happen with others. In terms of what the West can do, there's a very clear and direct answer. The answer is give weapons to Ukraine, give everything to Ukraine, give them tanks, give them ATACMS, give them long range missiles, give them ammunition, give them a navy, give them the capacity to defeat Russia. Because the arguments the Ukrainians make, and I'm speaking to you from Kiev, is completely persuasive, that Putin is not interested in diplomacy, he's not interested in negotiation, he's not interested in summits with America, with Joe Biden, with Donald Trump, whoever. He understands power, actually, and force, and the application of force. And so the best way to defeat him is to defeat him on the battlefield. And I find it extraordinary and dismaying that there are people in America, powerful people in the House and some in the Senate, who don't understand this, that um, this is not just a faraway problem. This is everyone's problem, including especially the US's problem. Because if
Yeah.
Ukraine falls, next will come the Baltic states, then Poland, then somewhere else. Putin feels he's in an existential struggle with America, the big and great enemy, and he is, having lost the Cold War, perhaps. I mean, you could make a case for that. He believes this is a rematch, which he's going to win. And the biggest thing that helps him is American division and weakness. So really, the corollary of all that is help Ukraine, arm the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are not asking for American troops; they're just asking for weapons. And if it were an equal fight between Ukraine and Russia, Ukraine would definitely win. The problem is at the moment it's a disequal fight, and the Russians are using their size, their war economy, the fact that they can sacrifice 500,000 guys, and there is no public outrage, to grind out slowly but surely some kind of victory here.
Yeah. Final thing, Paul Whelan, he called me from his Russian prison cell on Christmas Eve of 2023, and he had a very desperate message for President Biden and people in the United States. And he said, please don't forget me, because he said, I feel like you've left me twice, Mr. President. These are words that he said directly for the president, not to the president, but for, on my broadcast to get to the president, which I do believe they heard his staff said. But he said, I believe that Russia's working on a plan which will end up in me being left behind a third time. He's talking about the Brittany Griner and Trevor Reed exchanges. He's been there since 2018. And one of the things that he said to me during our several conversations was that he's worried that he might die in that prison, where he is, because of what he calls capos, the people who work in these prisons, that the enforcers, some of which are basically working for the Russian government. He's concerned about that fate befalling him. Can you address the likelihood of that?
I mean, it's very hard to say. I mean, Paul is obviously a kind of US citizen. I feel terribly for him. I think he's in a nightmare, and he's in a nightmare which, as he says, has dragged on for several years. And the problem, the sort of big problem, is that let's say in the best case scenario, Paul is swapped, and he's swapped soon. There's some kind of deal. He gets out. He's free and is reunited with his family. I mean, I very much hope that happens. That the Putin regime will take out the hostages. They just yesterday arrested a Russian American woman, a woman with American citizenship, American passport, who was living in LA, flew back to see her parents, and had donated to Ukraine, and is now arrested, and is obviously looking again at crazy treason charges of 10, 12, 15 years in jail.
Yeah.
There is an American journalist working for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. There's Evan Gershkovich. And so in a way, you get one hostage, you kidnap a civilian, you then trade them for a spy or a criminal like Victor Bout, and then you kidnap someone else, and so it goes on. It becomes a forever game, and we are in a place of kidnapping. So I would just say two things. One is I really hope Paul is released soon, and the other is, if you have an American passport, do not go to Russia. Very clear. Under any circumstances, do not go, because you could quickly find yourself a pawn in a big and terrible game.
Yeah. Anything you would like to add that you think is important before we finish our conversation today?
I mean, just one thing, which is that I go to the front line in Ukraine a lot. I spend time talking to Ukrainian soldiers, service personnel fighting in snowy trenches. I mean, the war close up looks like a mixture between the First World War, which we all know from movies, and some kind of high-tech war involving drones being flown by kids who are very, very good at video games, but with deadly results, where both sides are kind of blowing up tanks, armored vehicles, and so on. And I've met a lot of very brave people. They do not understand American politics. That they are fighting. They're fighting for their families, for their kids, for their country. It's an existential war. I mean, Ukraine either prevails or it disappears as a state, as a people, as a country, as a culture, as an entity. They're watching what happens in Capitol Hill, and they ask me, why are some powerful American politicians blocking it? I've got no good answer, but all I would say is I would urge those people who think that Ukraine is not America's problem, maybe come here and see for yourself, and see how brave and how extraordinary some of the people fighting are. And maybe if they came, they would change their mind.
Luke, it's a great pleasure to have had a chance to speak to you today. Thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for sharing these very, very important thoughts with us today. And hope you remain safe there, and of course, continue to educate the world with these wonderful books and these articles that you do for The Guardian every day.
Thank you. I really enjoyed our conversation, and it's very, very good to talk about these important themes. So thank you, and thank you for what you do too.